Welcome to this Java Break with Basis. Today's session will discuss developing a relational database management system application with Basis tools, and we'll focus specifically on Barista. Let's have a look at the topics that we'll cover in our agenda today. Firstly, we're going to talk about Basis tools and your data, how that data is structured. We'll talk about Barista and your data. And then we'll move on to a demonstration of Barista working with a relational database management system. And then finally, we'll take your questions. So firstly, let's look at Basis tools and your data. Basis data can be divided into two distinct types: our legacy types, table types like mkeyed, direct, sort, and indexed, and the newer table types that have been introduced with BBJ: xkeyed, which is an extension of the mkeyed type without any of its constraints; jkeyed, which has the journaling, commit, and rollback capability; vkeyed, with its variable length functionality, builds on xkeyed's capability; and ESQL, our exclusive SQL relational database management system table type. The next component I want to talk to is the Basis toolset. The Basis data dictionary can be managed from the IDE, from the Enterprise Manager, or from your standard SQL syntax. And then we have the Basis SQL engine. It's part of the interpreter. It's also accessible from ODBC and JDBC drivers. The Basis SQL engine follows the SQL 92, SQL 99, and SQL 2003 ANSI standards. For more information on the compliancy with those standards, please check the Basis documentation online. And finally, the Basis database management system is composed of three components: the data dictionary, the SQL engine, and the underlying data to make up the database management system. And if one looks at the Basis database management system with the ESQL table type, it makes up a relational database management system that meets all of COD's laws of compliancy to be determined a relational database management system. Now let's consider the tools in your data. Traditionally, we've given you access to the data via the language, direct access from Pro5, Visual Pro5, or BBJ in the form of read record or write record type verbs. And we can use that to access all of the Basis legacy and the newer table types. We also have SQL syntax access, and that is from the Visual Pro5 and the BBJ interpreters. Again, one can access the legacy table types using SQL syntax, as well as accessing any third-party relational database management system via a third-party ODBC or JDBC driver. Now, the data resides either in the Pro5 world, and BBJ can gain access to that data via the Pro5 data server or via shared file locking from the operating system. Or you have the choice of placing the data in the Basis database management system world under BBJ Services control. There's no data conversion required to move from the Pro5 world to the Basis DBMS world. And Pro5 can continue to access this data via the BBJ Pro5 data server. That's part of BBJ Services. And naturally, you could decide to put your data in a third-party database management system or relational database management system. And that access would be then provided from the Basis interpreters through a JDBC or ODBC driver provided by the third party. So let's look at these tools and what are your choices in working with third-party relational database management systems. We can utilize the Basis IDE. It comes with a fully featured editor with color syntax-aware coding, and it also has code completion for object notation, so for your custom objects. It also comes with a form builder for your screen design, an app builder to overcome the hurdle of dealing with the GUI event paradigm. It comes with record sets to abstract the access to the underlying data, be it in a legacy data file type or an SQL type. And we also have the form gen wizard. But today we'll focus on Barista, and that's probably most apt because it's a data dictionary-driven application development framework, and we'll be working with a third-party relational database management system with its own data dictionary. So Barista is written in BBJ and Java, so you have direct access to your legacy and your newer table types. So those mkeyed, xkeyed file types can be accessed either via read record, write record, or you can use SQL syntax to access legacy and newer table types as well as third-party relational database management system types. Again, the data can reside in the Pro5 world. It can reside in the BASIS database management system world, or could reside in the third-party DBMS, RDBMS of choice. And you can mix and match these two sources of data. So let's look at the third-party database access. The technical details that we'll cover is that we'll be utilizing a JDBC 2.0 compliant database driver. That's what's required for Barista to access the database. We'll be utilizing a client object that wraps java.sql classes, and we'll take advantage of BBJ's connection pooling algorithm. We've tested this with BASIS's legacy and our ESQL databases. We've tested with MySQL, with Microsoft SQL Server, with Oracle Express, and the Java database, Derby. So let's have a look at the demo. What are we going to cover in today's demo? We'll cover the setup of a database environment, Microsoft SQL Server 2008. We'll utilize the Microsoft SQL Server JDBC driver 2.0, and we'll utilize the freely available Adventureworks demo database. We'll import the data dictionary. We'll show a mini application running in Barista, and then we'll use Barista to fine-tune the forms. So let me hand over to my colleague from our European operation, Ralph Lance, who will take you through the demonstration today.
In order to be able to look briefly at the SQL Server Adventureworks demonstration database, I've started a program called DB Visualizer. It's freely available from the internet. As we see here, I've already connected to the Microsoft SQL Server 10, which is actually SQL Server 2008, and we're utilizing the SQL Server JDBC driver 2.0, which is the same JDBC driver we'll be using to connect inside of Barista. Taking a look at the tables of the Adventureworks database, we see that there are about 70 tables involved. We're going to be concentrating in the area of human resources and person. If we take a brief look at the relationships of the tables, in this selected area we see that the employee table plays a very central role in our scheme of things. We have simple relationships to other tables as well as one-to-N relationships between the employee table, the payment history, and the department history. Now let's take a look at what it means to integrate the JDBC driver and therefore the database with inside of BBJ and Barista. After having logged into the BBJ Enterprise Manager, we need to press on the Class Path tab located in the server information. Then we add the name of the jar file that contains the JDBC driver we'd like to use for the connection to the database. In our particular case, it's the SQL Server JDBC driver 2.0. After having done that and saved it, we now can set up a connection pool. A connection pool allows us to configure the JDBC access information outside of a program. And through the name of the connection pool, I'm able to access all of these setting information. Things like the JDBC Connect URL are available inside the documentation for the particular JDBC driver. Having done that, it gives us a small hint that we need to restart the BBJ services. That will make the pool Adventureworks available as well as the JDBC driver. Having restarted BBJ services, we're now ready to set up the database connection within inside of Barista itself. In the menu Barista Administration, there's a menu item called SQL Databases. We have set up an SQL database alias called Adventureworks, given it a description and the name of the driver class that is obtainable through the documentation for the JDBC driver. As a connection URL, we simply enter the name of the connection pool that we previously set up. The database username and password here in this form are solely for the purpose of testing the connection. We have a successful connection. So let's assign users accessibility to the database. On a per user basis, we have the menu item SQL database users. Given a database alias that we just previously set up, we assign here the username and the password specific for this Barista user. Again, in order to make sure that we have typed everything in correctly, we can test the connection. And sure enough, it still works with the SQL Server. After having created the connection information for the external SQL database, the next step is to create an application area inside of Barista to hold information about our application. We do so by selecting Create Application underneath the Barista Development menu. We give our application a name, fill out a few pieces of information. I can pretty much take the defaults. From this list of languages, I stipulate which languages I'd like to make available for perhaps later translation and localizing through other tools inside of Barista. I give my product an ID and a description. The product ID in combination with the company ID can be used in licensing to protect your intellectual property. These are some global variables, or STBLs, that are set up automatically by Barista. In our particular case, we only need the STBL that points to the Barista-owned data area for this application. So this brings us to the auto synchronization process. We choose our synchronization, essentially our configuration for the application, say synchronize, and the configuration is then imported into Barista itself. Having done so, we can then carry on with the import to the Barista data dictionary of the metadata that's coming from the external database. We choose the synchronization file and we assign the global variable that points to the Barista-owned data area for this application. An application prefix is always very handy for later searching of tables and data elements pertaining to the application. We choose the database alias that we set up and choose connect. Now use the user credentials that were assigned to the user where I am logged in. Say next, and I receive an overview of the columns within inside of the database. We see that, for example, the account number appears 2 times with different lengths and are found within these tables. Now, if it was important for the database handling, which in our case it is not, then we could tell Barista at the time of the import that a particular element type should be assigned for the account number that's only 10 characters long, and another data element that is assigned to the account number that is 15 characters long. There are some configuration, renaming, and assignment capabilities within inside the import process itself. For example, I know that there is a name that is character with 128 bytes, and I'd like to assign that a very particular element type called name 128 so that it doesn't collide with the other name column that will be seen within forms that we are dealing with. The same is true of the title that is only 8 characters long, I'd like to give that a specific data element name. So I choose Next. Now we have the list of tables. The first tables are system internal tables of the SQL Server, so I don't need those, but I will import the rest of the tables with a touch of 2 buttons. What's happening is that the metadata about the tables and columns and key and index information are being interpreted and converted to the Barista data dictionary. That didn't take long for the 66 or so tables that were just imported. And what we see on the left-hand side is the first menu structure, a default menu structure based on the schemes and tables that were found within inside the database. So the import did a lot of work in setting up the menu for you without you having to do anything but import the tables. We're going to be concentrating on the area of human resources. So I'll shorten these other tables. We will make one reference to the contact table as well. After having imported the tables and the menu has been built for me, then I can click on a menu item, and if Barista notices that the form associated with the table hasn't been built, then it builds it automatically. And I receive a fully functional data maintenance form with navigational and lookup capabilities, as well as filtering capabilities. For one record, I can print it, or I can print all records of the current table. I also have a lot of functionality out of the box for document management, mailing of reports as attachments to emails, or even faxing documents. Here I see that because I said I'd like to have it emailed, I can enter in email information, and off it goes. Let's take a look at our employee form. Now the employee form is somewhat longer as the department or job candidate or shift. And if we take a look, we see that there are references with different IDs that we suspect are pointing to other tables, and they actually are. We also see certain kinds of fields like marital status and gender, as well as maybe the salaried flag or the current flag. Now, this is rather flatly displayed. What we'd like to do is we'd like to change this form to make it more useful for us as users. Now, these things are done within inside of the Barista Development Form Manager primarily. If we click on Adventureworks, then the list of forms or tables are filtered to those that have been assigned to the Adventureworks application. That's done through the product ID as we see it here. Let's take a look at our employee form. So we're in the Form Manager. I'll undock the Applications menu to give us a little bit more real estate. And we see the default as Barista built the form without any consideration for prettiness. So the first thing that we see is there tends to be sort of a grouping of information here. Let's make it a little bit more visible by creating a tab for all of these ID sort of fields at the beginning of the record. After that, we have title, birth date, marital status, gender. Those are the types of things that we might want to assign to a tab called personnel. And then these couple of other flags, sort of miscellaneous fields down here at the bottom, they can be on their own tab. We'll just call it MISC for miscellaneous. And that's how easy it is to create tabs using the Barista Form Manager. Now, the other thing that we noticed is that some of these fields appear to be fields that might lend themselves to selections, for example, list buttons, or maybe even a checkbox. Let's save this off and go over to the menu again to see what's inside of the table. Taking a look briefly, we see that the marital status seems to be M for married, probably, S for single. Gender is M and F for male and female. Now the salaried flag looks like it's simply a digit 1 when someone is salaried. And in similar fashion, the current flag probably means that the employee is active. With this knowledge, we can now go into the Form Designer, and directly from the Form Designer, we can do some pretty nifty things. We can go over to the element type that's behind the marital status field and say we'd like to have a list button up here. We'd also like to say we'd like to have the description and the single letter code that is assigned to the description. And we can, after having saved that, we can set up the element list definition. This is where we say that the code M means married, the code S is single, and we're just guessing, we'll say W is widowed. We save this off. So the other thing was the gender. We can also go into the element type and stipulate in a similar fashion that it is a list button. We'd like to have the description of the code. We save this and build a list definition where we have M being male and F being female. So let's not stop there. We had the salaried flag, and we saw that it appears to be a Boolean flag, and a Boolean lends itself to a checkbox. So it's a numeric value. We'd like to have it a checkbox. And we'd like to have the validation. We'd like to have a 1 assigned if they are salaried, otherwise a 0. Save that off. And we have a couple of other things. Similar fashion is the current flag to say whether the information is current or whether the employee is active, depending on the interpretation of the application itself. And then what we also see is we see this row GUID. The row GUID is a database-specific thing, and we really don't need to see that all over the place. So there's a setting for an element type called none or hidden, which means that the field will be maintained, but we just won't see it on any forms. So let's go ahead and do that for the row GUID, because we don't need this database internal information to be shown. And last but not least, we have the modified date. Now the modified date is something special because it needs to be set to a value when we are creating new records, for example. Now, we can do that one way by entering a formula that we'd like to have resolved to a string inside the default value itself. What we're going to use is we're going to use the date formatting capabilities of BBJ to say we'd like to have a 4-character year, a 2-character zero-filled month. We'd like to have a 2-character zero-filled day. And then we'd like to have, well, it's not that important right now about the time, so let's just fulfill the requirement of the data field itself that the SQL database is going to want. So having done that, I can also say that I'd like to only see the information and not have users manipulate it. This is done through the optional definitions that are available for forms and columns. Having clicked on the modified date, I have down here in the properties the optional definitions. If I click that, I can say that I would like to have this particular column and its data only display in all cases. So having done that, I can now rebuild the form. If I wanted to, I could also save the step of the rebuild before display by simply pressing the F5 button or running the process. This automatically runs the form after having built it. So now I see my new form with its tabs, and look at that. I have drop downs. I have the salaried flag and the current flag as checkboxes, and I have a typo in my modified date. So let's take care of that before we do anything else. Go into our element type, and sure enough, I forgot the % sign in front of the Y. So let's run it again. And look at that, I have a nicely formed form with tabs and list boxes. If I scroll through the records, then we see the salary flag sometimes being checked, sometimes not. And back here, we see that the modified date has a value and is not editable by the user. But let's not stop there. Let's go to the next step and make some relationships. Now, we saw that the employee has a one-to-N relationship to the pay history and to the department history. So what we can do is we can, inside the form manager, we can choose to show the table information that's pertaining to an entry. Let's take a look at the department history first of all. And we know that we can assign as the primary table the employee table because they're connected over the employee ID. I'll save this information. And the same is true of the payment history. We'll go into the maintain table of the payment history and also key in the employee table as the primary table. Now what this means is that when I am inside of the employee form itself, inside the form designer, I now have available the possibility of these two subtables to be specially managed by Barista. For example, I can say that the department history should be a grid underneath the main form. And the other, the payment history, because it's a little bit more sensitive information, I'd like to have just made available easily, but I don't want to show it immediately. So I'll just say OK. Let's take a look. From the form designer, I just pressed the run process. The form is built automatically, and the result is displayed on the screen. So there we have it, a full functioning form with tabs, special controls, as well as the detail grid down at the bottom, which is bound through the employee ID. And for each employee, I also have access to their pay history in case there are any. Now the pay history we see here is a form. We'd like to have that as a grid. And the other thing is we see that the ID, the employee ID, is repeated between the main form and the detail grid. That's easily repaired, I guess you could say. We go into the department history form and say we'd like to have the ID through the optional definition to be hidden in the maintenance grid. So that takes care of one piece. Rebuild the form. Now the other piece was the payment history. The payment history is defaulted to be a maintenance form. What we'd like to have is we'd like to have it as a grid form when called up from the employee main form. So having done that, I can just run directly from the form manager, and I should see that the employee ID has now been removed from the detail grid. And if I scroll through the records and show the employee pay history, then the form is a grid, and Barista has automatically suppressed the employee ID column because of the relationship between the tables. So there you have it, a full-fledged, good-looking, modern GUI form. The only thing left to do to really finish this off and to have the best form possible is to show more easily that there are tables behind some of these ID fields. We do so by going to the form manager, pressing the right mouse button, and say maintain table for the table we'd like to connect to. In one case, it's the contact table. Now the contact table has an element type, contact ID. The contact ID is a field or a column within inside of the employee table. So if I choose the AW contact ID element type, then I can display its master record. And we see that the validation table to the contact table has already been applied during the import into Barista. What is missing is that the data column, in our case the last name, is the information similar to this information here to the right of the validate data table. So we'll save that. And the same is true of the manager ID. Now the manager ID is something specific. It points to the employee table. So let's go into the employee table itself and say that the employee ID points to the employee table,